Credit ratings. Again, that's another part of the financial regulation that has been a lot in the press. There's been a lot of articles in the press. Some concern about regulating credit rating agencies, some very extreme proposals. And I'll tell you in a few minutes, developments on the regulatory front. But what have people noted about credit rating agencies? I think there's probably little debate about these observations here. The credit rating agencies failed to foresee the downturn in real estate prices. That is their biggest mistake. You don't have to go very far. That was really by far their biggest mistake. Failing to see the downturn in real estate prices, they did not foresee the refinancing risk for subprime loans. That's why so many subprime mortgage products blew up. Because when real estate prices started declining, and when the refinancing time came, households in the subprime category, a lot of them just couldn't refinance. They were basically forced to default. They relied on imperfect historical data on past prime lending. You run with the data you have, but certainly that was they probably weren't paying sufficient attention to that. They ignored moral hazard in origination. Okay, at least there's not much evidence that they paid attention to moral hazard in origination. And more controversially, I will argue, and again, we're making the point bigger than it truly deserves to be, to emphasize it. There's also a positive side to securitization. But here, credit rating agencies invited manipulation through tranching, credit enhancement, etc. Okay, and the most extreme form of that is you have, CDOs and CDOs, right? CDOs are pools of securitized subprime mortgages. So you put a lot of mortgages. A lot of securitized mortgages that have let's say a BBB rating into a CDO pool, and then magically the CDO is rated AAA. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but Chris has a lot to say about that. But but that was part of the inviting manipulation. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? So the title of the paper is The Credit Ratings Game. And so what we're doing is we're looking at competition between rating agencies, looking at how they're getting paid and how you might be able to, just out of a theoretical analysis, say something about whether some of these problems could have been anticipated or an outcome of how the market works or not. Okay, and so in this paper, well, we're really emphasizing three conflicts that the credit rating agencies were facing. Let me read them to you. The first one is a credit rating agency conflict of interest, possibly leading to rating inflation. That's the thing that's often emphasized. So basically, credit rating agencies, they get paid by the issuer. And if the issuer doesn't like the rating, the issuer doesn't have to buy the rating. That creates an obvious conflict of interest. It's as if we were paid by our students to give them grades, and the students could choose not to buy our grades, right? And we were paid, that would be our salary, right? That would be a problem. I mean, you could see where that would go. Anyway, so let me not push the analogy too far. That's one point. Issuer shopping. Okay, that's another point. That's another problem. Issuer shopping is you want to issue a product. You go to S&P. You ask them for a rating. You don't like the rating. You go to Moody's. They give you a better rating. You buy the better rating. Okay. Now, rating agencies are very, very aware of this problem. They're aware that their market share gets eroded if they start tightening, unilaterally tightening their rating standards. And those two things I think are fairly obvious. What I want to, however, put the most emphasis on is the third point, where you might say that's the most trivial point, the most obvious point, but it's the most critical point for our analysis. And that is, there is a clientele out there, not everybody, but a substantial fraction of investors that are trusting, i.e., they just go and buy the rating. They don't ask, was this done well, was it inflated, or anything like that. They just buy the rating. So either they buy the rating because they're naive, or because of institutional constraints, that they're only allowed to buy certain products if it gets AAA rating, and as long as it gets a AAA rating, no questions asked, we'll buy the product. Okay, so there may be agency problems behind this trusting investor clientele. But the fact is, well, you put these three things together and you create a problem. And in particular, you create a problem because of the trusting investor clientele. So if you had purely rational investors, if everybody was really rational, understood how this game works, understood the conflicts, wouldn't be much of a problem. So it would be an inefficient industry. You wouldn't be able to assign much information to the rating. But a lot of the problems that we've seen just wouldn't be there. So they're there because of the existence of this trusting clientele. And so what do we find? Point number one, the biggest point of the paper. We like this a lot because it runs so counter everything that we believe in. Right? Point number one, competition among credit rating agencies reduces market efficiency. So our model delivers the result that if you had a monopoly rating agency, you'd be better off than having a duopoly. You're better off with a duopoly than having 3 firms competing. Competition is just a bad thing here. The point is that competition is also bad if you have purely rational investors. And the reason is that you have rating agency shopping. Competition gives you choice to pick the rating you like. Okay? That's a big distortion that you're going to get out of this market. There are incentives there because the model has a proportion of trusting investors and a proportion of rational investors. So to the extent that your market share is mostly rational investors, and you're trying to sell issues to them, they're the marginal investor. So they're the ones who actually will try and read into the informational value of the rating. Well, the more accurate the rating, the more valuable it is, and the higher price you can charge. So let's say in a monopoly rater, right?
Like multi-period models?
Well, we're this, multi-period is not that essential. But the point is that, you as a rater, your incentives are you would like to sell information essentially, right? Now, to the extent that your information is more accurate, is known to be more accurate, people are willing to pay more for it. So there is an incentive there. Now the incentive, I think your intuition is correct. Your incentive is gone.
How does the consumer know that it's more accurate?
Well, these are rational investors. They understand what your compensation is, what your incentives are, what your cost structure is. So in equilibrium, they can figure out whether you will be producing more accurate signals or not. So the incentive is there, but no. Once the marginal investor is a trusting investor, the incentive is gone. You're just telling them everything's AAA, so you don't have to do any research, right? I mean, the research. I mean, there's one caveat. You will be actually. Let me jump one slide ahead to explain that. So the elements of the model. In the model, rating agencies have reputation concerns that partially discipline them. Okay, so to the extent that you worry about reputation, you have an incentive to find out how accurate the signal is. Okay, but once you've decided, well, I'm going to sell to the trusting investors, what's the point of having a good signal or a bad signal? But let me come back. So this is one conclusion. Competition among credit rating agencies reduces market efficiency. because it creates stronger incentives to inflate ratings, and it gives issuers huge advantage in shopping. Okay, so those are two really bad things. So let's put this into light with where regulation is today and what has been debated. Well, so far nothing's been done about that. So far the thinking is still we need to introduce more competition. That there's a duopoly, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and we need to, and Fitch, actually the three firms, we need to have more entry here. This is not a competitive industry. That's a bad thing. A lot of discussion been about that. Well, if you take this analysis on board, that would not necessarily be a good thing. Now, wait just one second. So the other thing that I thought was very interesting, there was one proposal which hasn't been adopted in the end in the Senate, which would speak to this model, and that was that instead of letting the issuer have discretion on choosing which rating to buy, there would be an agency that would pick the rater for the issuer. Okay, so now there are problems with thinking about an agency doing this well or not, but it cuts right into this issue here. That if you have some third party come in and say, well, no, you have to buy Moody's rating, you have no choice, that's the only rating there is for you, you're going to solve a lot of problems. That's going to be a good thing. That's another way of reducing competition. Right? It doesn't mean you just want to have one firm. I think you want diversity of opinion, diversity of ratings. That's a good thing. But you want to reduce discretion on the part of the issuer. Okay? There are other ways of doing it. Like for accounting firms, there has to be some rotation. You could imagine that for a repeat issuer, there has to be rotation of the rating agency. Okay, so these are things that I think analysis, our analysis sheds light on, and these are things that could still happen. So I think, as far as I can tell, credit rating agencies, it's very much still an open question what will happen. So SEC has become more involved. There have been some changes in terms of liability for rating agencies in the Dodd-Frank bill. That has to be sorted out. So on our analysis, a lot of what's been done isn't necessarily the right direction. And we're emphasizing other stuff. We're emphasizing, based on our analysis, that it makes more sense to do the following three things. First, mandate upfront payments for rating services. That's like, that should be obvious. That's like how we are paid. Second, mandatory disclosure of any rating produced by CRAs. That cuts into the shopping issue. Third, oversight of ratings methodology to mitigate rating inflation and promote efficiency. So we're more, at that level. And there's a lot of stuff that we're not recommending where it seems like certainly the SEC is going. So one of the things, the SEC wants to reduce reliance of investors on ratings. So that's been hotly debated. So to say that you shouldn't you shouldn't require ratings for certain institutional investors for them to be able to buy the product, the security. Now, our thinking on that is that, in fact, rating agencies are fulfilling, if it's done right, it's an enormously efficient service. Because let's say we were in a world with no rating agencies at all. So we would have all these bonds that are issued, millions of bond issues. We would have to find out how risky they are on our own. It's really incredibly expensive. It would be enormous duplication of due diligence and so on. So it makes a lot of sense to concentrate that in sort of expert agencies. But then, of course, you have to get the the incentives right. Okay, so I just had a quick look at the clock. I think my time's over. There were 2 more papers I was going to talk to you about. Let me not go into them. But the point is, what I wanted to say is that there's an opportunity for all of us in the finance division to think about what's happened, the new regulation that's coming. And it's just a very exciting time, I think, to do research because there's so many low-hanging fruits. We didn't have that, a few years ago, and now we have a huge, a lot of toys to play with. So let me stop here.